Stage set. I'm Steve Erlanger, working for the New York Times. And it's a pleasure to be here in this stunning place, this historical place. One can hear the ghosts, maybe it's a bit haunted. But here we are to discuss democracy, and to discuss democracy in the big enchilada, which is the United States. This election is not far away. And I'm sure you all know about the United States, but it's our job to help you understand this election better. I remember talking to lots of friends all around the world, sometimes in conflict and sometimes not, and sometimes over a drink, and almost universally they moan. They say, your president, like it or not, is our president. I mean, the power of the American presidency is so extraordinary. It may be lessening in a world of demographic changes, to be sure, but it still matters quite a lot. And when Ukraine happens or the Mideast happens, somehow it ends up at the White House. So this election is a crucial moment for truth. And I would say, I think we'll all agree it's too close to call right now. And as you know, it's 50 separate elections. That's the oddity of our Constitution, of the Electoral College. And it's worth remembering, I'll just say this briefly, thanks to Rob's work. In 2016, Trump lost by 3 million popular votes, but won the election. Last time, Joe Biden won by more than 7 million votes, popular, but he won the presidency by about 44,000 votes in a very small number of constituencies spread over a few states. So that's the election. We can talk about Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, certainly Pennsylvania. These are the voters that will get a lot of the attention, a lot of the advertisements, for which I don't envy them, and a lot of the money. So here we are to help explain what's going on and to see what the rest of the world might think of it. So I'm first going to call on Amy. Tell us the state of the race.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for allowing us to be here. I will say that I'm not here as well to reassure you that this will not be a complicated election. This might not even be a deliberative election on November 5th. It is unprecedented. If you can all remember, the last time we had a presidential campaign, we were also in the middle of a global pandemic. So the typical use of tactics that campaigns use were not available to us. We also had the change of our nominee on the Democratic side mere months ago. So not that I'm checking, but we are 33 days, 5 hours, and 59 minutes away from our election. And I just wanted to share a little, the way I always look at it is really from 3 perspectives, and that's money, message, and momentum. Obviously, money in U.S. elections is just unbelievable. We are on track to outside spending will far surpass $1 billion in this election, nearly 2 times what we saw in 2020. That's $585 million alone on the presidential race. The interesting part is at this point, we're also seeing that as of the August 31st financial filing that we have to do in the United States, the Harris campaign had $500 million. $361 million alone was raised in August. The Trump campaign has $268 million. So even while she has a bit of a financial advantage, she also has to do catch up where she has to introduce herself to these voters. And so this money will be essential to do that. The 2020 election cost a lot of money to have 156 million people, or 66% of our voting population, to turn out. The spending alone in the battleground states, Steve, that you mentioned, are $295 million by Harris and $194 million by Trump. These are in just these 7 states alone where the battle is playing, where the math is adding up. Now, message is not unlike what you're seeing also globally, but I think the top three issues are definitely the abortion issue that you're seeing that resonated with the changes in our laws and with the Roe v. Wade being overturned. It certainly was at play in our midterm elections in 2020 and is a driving force in the conversation in this election. Immigration is a huge issue. I think you see the Republicans weaponizing it in a lot of respects and certainly holding the Harris team accountable for the work that she did during the Biden administration. And of course, the economy. And this is a difficult needle, certainly, for Vice President Harris to thread because she has to champion the issues that she worked on with the Biden administration while also separating herself out as a new visionary looking forward. And certainly the Trump campaign might eventually tell us what they stand for or have some substance on the issues, and we're waiting to see as we have them going through all the states. Now, momentum. Momentum is always a huge part for any campaign. If you were paying attention to when Vice President Harris became the nominee, in that first 24 hours, she raised $100 million. 62% of that came from brand new donors, people that hadn't engaged in the election yet. And she was able to get 58,000 volunteers in that first day. So the momentum, I think, is certainly there, but it's on for both sides. I think you see people supporting the Trump campaign, people supporting the Harris campaign at high levels. I also think that, it's important to note that a lot of this is a non-COVID campaign now. So when you look at grassroots actions, you see the Harris campaign in one weekend have 2,000 events. They have 370 digital interactions, 312 offices, and 2,000 staff across the country. When you look at the momentum on the Trump side, that is not the same scale. What we're hearing is there's certainly less on the ground or voter contact. There's more recruitment of poll watchers on election day. And the Trump strategy is really to look at those low propensity voters and try and turn them out. I think that what you're seeing is also in the polling, just this neck and neck. The New York Times came out with a poll as of Saturday saying that in Michigan, Vice President Harris was only up by 1 point, in Wisconsin, only up by 2. Of course, this is closing a gap that we saw with Biden early on that was very significant. So these are all the factors.
And within the margin of error.
Within the margin of error. Now, as we know, polling is only a snapshot in time, but it is an indicator of where you can put resources. We watch the candidates and follow where they're traveling, and we're looking to see where they're spending this copious amounts of money. 30% is what you will see on ads alone on this and how they do, the ground game. There's also just not a consensus on, we won't know on November 5th. In 2020, the last thing I will say is that 46% of those that voted by mail or voted early. So I think this will be a long process for us in 2024.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Rob, there are lots of things to ask you, but one of the things that sort of, why is it so odd, the system, and how can it go wrong?
Good combination. So one, well, here we are in this, remarkable place that also brings to mind history and architecture. And so the Constitution has established an architecture for the presidential election. States have built within it. And so we have an electoral college. What states do is something that's been established over time and sort of hardened by about 1850. So still very old. But what all states do when they vote for president is have elections, which they didn't do for a little while, many states, for president. And whoever gets the most votes in that state gets 100% of electoral votes. It's a winner-take-all system. And when we talk about the issues that are affecting this election, what really will matter is this small sliver of voters that aren't already sort of calcified with one party or the other. So we are in this electorate that is nearly 50-50, locked in for one party or the other. Not that they're necessarily registered with that party or love that party, but they don't like the other party. And so that has meant that almost every Senate race is locked in for the party that has the majority, and almost every presidential outcome in every state is just absolutely locked in. And they all know it, and the 7 swing states are the same closest states as 2020, and winning that state changes who gets those electoral votes, and it's really about affecting 2% or X very small number of people in each state who might care about immigration or just high prices, and it's been kind of a rocky time, and they want to vote for change. And what we're seeing is that incumbent parties around the world have had a kind of a rocky time, and that's, the Democrats are the incumbent party. So in some ways, that's the basic dynamic. And those rules, by the way, are changeable. So we may talk some about that. This may be the last election in which we're sort of suffering through these kinds of rules. But right now, it also means...
This also may be our last election, if you believe
right.
Donald Trump.
Though I did want to borrow a line from last night, which sort of amend it or revise it, which was that there was one positive aspect was of apartheid was the anti-apartheid movement, right? And that one positive part of the incredible challenges that American democracy is facing is there's a very fascinating, exciting, encouraging response to that. That is absolutely necessary for us to be the model for other countries that we'll talk a little bit about today, that we're not right now, and yet I think that there is promise to do so. Just to lift up the danger we face because of the outcome in just a handful of close states, meaning everything, is that the vote counting is actually going to be done quite professionally. We have very good election officials in these swing states, but they're going to be under incredible pressure, incredible claims that may not be true. There is also a lot of players in the counting process and the certification process that can be pressured and can maybe not do the right thing. And then if it all comes down again to 5,000, 10,000 votes in one or two states, and by the way, the most possible outcome, or if I were to pick the outcome that is most likely right now, it's Harris getting 270 electoral votes and Trump getting 268. That's if the states were sort of to lock in right now the way they seem to be, which would mean just a single state changes that. And so that's where the courts come in, the Supreme Court comes in, the behavior of the candidates comes in, and the eyes of the world will be watching.
Yeah, I mean, what worries me is it's all going to end up in the courts, and as it did with Gore, and who knows what will happen and when we'll finally get a resolution. There are lots of things to ask you, but Maria, first, you in a way have a special place on this panel. I mean, you're fond of America, you're watching it, but how much does it matter, this election, and what does the world think of it? Does the world begin to think this is not a model for anyone anymore? What happens if it goes one way or another? What kind of difference do you think all of this could make?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to the Athens Democracy Forum. Thank you for all of you also for what you've been saying and what we have heard these past 2 days. Thank you very much. I think what you said at the beginning, Steve, about a friend saying that voting for the US president is something that matters to all. It does matter to all. And I think that at this moment in time, we have to think not only of what the US election and the results of the US election is going to mean for others, but what the world situation is going to mean for the US election. So it's a two-way thing. It's a two-way focus that we have to have in this particular election. Because we have to look at it, what it means nationally, and that's what we've heard Rob and Amy describe, but also globally, because this is an election that, yes, everybody, I think, or a lot of people are watching. I think that the entire world is watching today because of the situation and because of the fact that it's diametrically opposed possibilities, or what we would be getting seem to be at least diametrically opposed. Part of it would be if Kamala Harris wins, let's say, there is a certain degree of continuity that people expect, continuity in many of the policies, especially in terms of foreign policy. But if Donald Trump wins, then that is a completely different situation and would only add to that sense of confrontation that the world is really not in the mood to continue or to take up again. And if we look at what I was saying earlier in terms of what is happening in the world that is affecting this election, we are facing, all of us are facing 2 wars, one in Europe and one in the Middle East, plus over 50 armed conflicts, over 92 countries or nations that are somehow involved in other conflicts, cross-border conflicts. This includes obviously those 56 other armed conflicts. We have disruptive, very, very disruptive autocratic forces that we see in places and in countries we didn't expect to find autocracies and authoritarianism rising, countries that had to fight and toil very hard either to regain their long-gone democracies, as is the case in many of the Latin American countries, or to gain them from scratch, let's say. So we find that even in these countries, we find this not only rise of authoritarianism, but also this coalition building to a certain extent, or partnerships arising amongst these autocracies and these authoritarian states. And this, it's all of this in the midst of what we have all been aware of for now a number of years, which is the erosion of democracy. The fact that we find that there are forces that are gnawing at democracy, and that is something that is a reality, and that the whole world is feeling. And this is creating increasing tension, I'd say, a lot of in terms of the expectations for this election, because yes, the US was in many ways the paradigm of democracy and has been a country that has been supporting democratic or democratization processes in very many different parts of the world. So that is a reality. Now, in these past years, and the present administration has done a lot in terms of multilateral cooperation, and has paid a lot of attention, if we remember, just in the past years, even on the problems and the challenges of democracy, the Summit for Democracies that the Biden administration started, I think it was 3 years ago or 4 years ago. So
then rather dropped.
Exactly, and so this is something that there has been a specific effort on the part of the U.S. in terms of multilateral agreements, multilateral cooperation for trade reasons and for self-interest. Yes, of course, but these have been there has been this sense of with the difference that always exists, but there has been a sense of an administration that has reached out to others, and that has reached out in this area of democracy. Now, if we want to look at what, obviously each different country, each different region will have a different reaction and a different feeling in terms of the US election. But it is this idea that yes, this is an election that matters, and it can, I'm not going to be too dramatic and say it can either make it or break it, but it can very, very seriously affect democratic development in many regions.
Thank you for that. I mean, because one of the things that we always used to assume, which was that foreign policy was basically bipartisan. I mean, that was the assumption. That's what I grew up with. I mean, that stopped. I mean, I don't think voters necessarily vote on issues of foreign policy, but they might in some of these key states. But for our friends and adversaries and rivals abroad, there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, because first of all, Trump is unpredictable anyway. And second of all, to be honest, I mean, I don't know much about what Kamala Harris thinks about the world at all, because she doesn't really want to tell us. So one of the questions that I just want to raise, which is, you've said it's on the edge and it could come down to a small number of people. They haven't decided yet, right? I mean, when do they decide, these people?
Voters are voting. I mean, they are voting in the states. There's several states that they're already voting. I mean, in some of these battleground states, we're seeing between 12 and 16% that are still possibly undecided.
Those are the ones I'm asking about.
Yeah, I mean, that has to be like, went by their plan to vote, and the hope is that even these undecideds don't drop off, but there's an intention to vote as well. We just had a vice presidential debate. Some of us streamed like crazy this morning, but it didn't seem to move the needle. It was almost a neutralizing factor, on both sides. But this is where the candidates are making the case and going out into these states, and they have to close this scene, rather quickly. But there's also, registration. National Voter Registration Day was September 17th. Some of these states, there's also individuals in some of these battleground states that you can register, same-day registration. So the interesting thing is there's also some of these communities that play a big role in deciding some of these voting blocks where Black women registration is doubled. For younger Americans, there was, a registration spike, after Harris was the nominee, after Taylor Swift did what Taylor Swift did. So we've got some interesting dynamics, but I do think that, some of these decisions, where the polls will go from here. I also feel like Trump has hit a ceiling in some of these, places. And whereas Harris has room to go, like, has he hit where the, majority of voters that he can get in some of these states?
Yeah, I'll just comment that there are kind of two kinds of swing voters in a sense. One is those who are likely to vote and just generally undecided, and that's like inflation is too high or whatever it is that might be affecting that decision. Then there's the people who might not vote. And that really was Trump's contribution to our system in recent years, is that he doesn't really go after traditional swing voters in the traditional way. He is a mobilizer of people who have been disaffected. And so our turnout was the highest of voting age population in 2020 it ever had been. Adding in women that we didn't have back in the 1800s. We may beat that this time, even though, again, 43 states are just nervous spectators and symbolic participants, really, in this election. So that's a wild card, right? And because you don't quite know, and we do have same-day registration in Wisconsin, say, or something, and if we're just talking about the margins. And also we do have third-party candidates. They're not nearly as strong as you often see in other countries, but they're there, and we don't have a majority system. We don't have ranked choice voting yet in all but 2 states have it, and 48 don't. So that any vote for Jill Stein of the Green or the Libertarian Chase Oliver, who's on every swing state ballot, that's 1% there too, right? And it's going to come down to inches that way.
I mean, which states do those third-party candidates seem to have the most impact?
Georgia's a big state where last time, they didn't have these third-party candidates on the ballot. So that's one I'm certainly watching to see what that third-party impact could be.
Yeah, and the Libertarian Party generally draws more from the Republican side. It's a government should be small party. Less taxes, and then the Green Party generally takes party votes that might otherwise go to the Democrat. Michigan has a dynamic where there's a number of unhappy Arab American voters with the Democratic ticket, and it's just an unknown what's going to happen.
But one thing, Steve, if I may, one thing you said that Kamala Harris has to still tell us what her ideas on foreign policy are, but what's interesting is that if we look at the 3 issues that you mentioned as the key issues, immigration may be one that has to do with foreign policy, but the rest is national. And that means that even though the U.S. does play this very important role, obviously, in international affairs, foreign policy is not an issue in the agenda of any of the candidates.
I would say it's not maybe necessarily an issue of when voters go to the polls or thinking about. Where I think it finds a really interesting thread is when we talk about leadership styles, and we talk about that is where I think foreign policy plays a big role in, are they going to be diplomatic, or are they going to be tough with dictators, this is where I think that does come into play with the average voters, because that leadership style is what they're reacting to on the foreign policy front in some respects.
And Trump does run to a degree as a no-war candidate. He's sort of against endless wars and against the Iraq War, and this America First mentality means it's like, why are we worrying about Ukraine? And and so there's a certain set of Americans that do respond to, we spend too much money on that and we should be focused on home.
No, and also, I mean, I'm reminded a bit of Richard Nixon, who ran on his secret plan to solve the war in Vietnam, and he never had to detail what that plan was, but it attracted voters to him. And Trump similarly says, I'll solve this in a day and I'll solve that in a day. And one can guess how he thinks he's going to do it, but he certainly won't explain how. And yet,
He doesn't have a plan, he's formulating a plan.
he's formulating a plan. But I think for some voters, particularly the people who already like him, I mean, they're attracted to this kind of strongman stuff, that I'm going to stand up for American interests, and that the Biden administration has somehow allowed these wars to happen and doesn't seem to be able to end them. And this is why Gaza, for instance, I think is quite an interesting issue. Now, maybe foreign policy doesn't normally matter, but it might matter in Michigan. It might matter other places. It's hard to say. I mean, I don't know how deeply one even wants to get into this, but to me, questions are, how are Jews going to vote and where? How are Latinos going to vote and where? Will Republican women turn against Trump over abortion, or will they stick with him? Will minorities come out to vote? Will it rain? I mean...
Yeah, I think one of the dangers in American politics, oftentimes we treat these voting blocks as a monolith, and they're not, and they're also, we call them base voters or traditional voters, but they're persuasive voters in a lot of these respects. And, while they might have a propensity to vote in a certain way, they're not a monolith within their own. That goes for young people, that goes for certainly women, communities of color as well.
And then I was just going to briefly address, if it's okay, sort of how we got here and what we might be doing about it. So one part of our system that the United States does that no other country that I know of does, which is it pays for parties to nominate their candidates in primaries. So we have primary elections, and we have voting rules of first past the post plurality system that really makes it exceptionally hard for third parties to amount to more than being these symbolic candidates that can split the vote. And so whoever wins a major party nomination has a 50-50 chance at least as far as just being one of the two candidates that have a chance to win. Then you layer into that 95% of the country, or at least 90% of it, is locked in for one party. Whoever wins the primary is safe to win. And so what we've seen is that these primary electorates are getting more and more sort of radicalized to be against the other party, and the reward for candidates to win those primaries is to be very much against the other party and very polarizing, and that's what voters are looking for, to kind of protect them from the other party. And that is how most people win their primaries. And that's where we end up in these general elections where we have two candidates that really aren't necessarily in the middle. They're sort of trying to get a few voters in the middle, but there's not much of a middle left. And so there's some changes going on. As I mentioned, a couple of states do use ranked choice voting for presidential elections, Maine and Alaska. They're not two of the bigger states, but that's on the ballot in 4 more states. Several of those states are voting to sort of bust up the primary system as well. So we have Nevada, Colorado, Idaho. It's already used in Alaska, where this sort of primary problem, in a sense, is being sought to be addressed with changes. That's on the ballot in a number of places. And there's a change moving past in 17 states that would effectively have states work together to establish a national popular vote for president. That actually is closer than people realize to winning. So that's where the kind of the promise, the reaction to all this is that we don't have to just be passively getting through this. I mean, we aren't passively getting through this election, but also we don't have to passively accept the rules that got us to this point, where it comes down to just these very somewhat quirky factors that determine the fate of the world.
Can you explain very briefly what ranked voting is, how it works? Or is that impossible?
It is. It's pretty
His favorite thing
straightforward.
to do. He can do this, I know.
Amy, you're right. Well,
do it briefly.
I'll do it briefly. And if we have Australians in the audience, they've used it for 100 years. But you aren't limited to just a single tick on the ballot. This is electing one person, but you're not limited to just vote for one person. You can rank a second choice and a third choice, in which people often have opinions about more than one person. So they can express that on the ballot. You go all in with your first choice. If someone has won a majority, 50%, you have a winner because they have more than half. If you don't have a majority, what a lot of countries do is have a separate runoff election for president. That's what the norm is. You have the top two face off in a runoff. But that's really hard to do in the United States. We don't have that many runoffs. Those ballots, those rankings are like a runoff, so that if you voted for a weaker candidate, your candidate doesn't advance, doesn't get to the runoff, and your ballot then goes to your next choice who is in the runoff. So essentially you have an instant runoff background on those rankings. So it goes from like 48 to 47 to 3 to 51 to 49.
Well, this is all for the future. When we look at this election, we just see all this polarization. The polls, I mean, we'd have to look up exactly which polls, but in general, the polls have Republicans who think Democrats do not have the country's interests at heart, and Democrats who don't think the Republicans have the country's interests at heart. And just one or two thoughts about how we got here. It's not just belief in different things, it's a disbelief in the integrity of the other party, which seems to me extraordinary and deeply damaging. And it's not just disagreeing about facts, it's a whole worldview that is kind of dystopian. So I'm just curious if any of you have thoughts about how we got there.
Well, I do think it comes from our leaders. And so when there's no incentives to work together, when you're penalized to work together, when you're creating this kind of sense of division, I think it's perpetuated. I see this more on our federal system. There are pockets, and Rob, I'm sure you've seen this like on the state and local level where people are coming together and, being able to do this. There have been initiatives where they've come together in the, federal government, like the immigration bill that was moving forward. But I do think it's having worked also in the U.S. Congress, it's these leaders that aren't incentivized to work together are actually penalized because it is more important to hold the gavel, than to do that. But I do think, if I could just briefly, the Sine Institute recently did a poll of young Americans, 18 to 34, and we asked them what their leadership requirements are, what their leadership, styles are. And one of the things that was really, going to your point, resonated so well is that, and we have so many incredibly young people join us at this conference, is that they felt that that one of the worst traits of the leaders that they see in front of them is that they don't come together to solve problems. And so there's not this tolerance with the younger people as well to see that. They want people coming together. They see these leaders as not really working in the best interest or working on issues that they care about. So again, I think there's going to be pressure for these leaders to try and work together, especially if the electorate engages and demands it. But I do think that that's some of the major problems we've seen that has driven us to this place.
But also I think there's something that I think has to be avoided is this constant reference to the lack of trust. There is lack of trust, but we cannot go into this downward spiral all the time. And I think that has captured the minds of people not only in the US, but everywhere. I do think an effort has to be made for a more positive narrative. I've just spent a week in New York following from civil society, but following UN General Assembly activity and everything that went on. I don't remember anybody saying anything positive about what happened that week, or about anybody that engaged in anything officially that week. And well, we may like it or not, but we do have, for example, a pact for the future. Well, consensus was reached, so let's use it. But we have to move away. I think we all have to make an effort. And in the US, in this election, I think it's particularly important. And I think that's part of the positive energy that Kamala Harris brought in that immediate, the nomination. And when you were talking about the message and the momentum, I think that is part of what's important.
I think joy does matter. We'll see if it wins. Rob, do you have a last thought?
I will share the spirit of my wife's group, Represent Women. It's intriguing that a woman may become president in the United States. It has never happened. And that essentially women are becoming a much bigger part of her party, and how that plays out is sort of an important aspect of this election, and also a message to the world. But I think that what happened in 2020 was there was incredible pressure on a lot of key players, and it held, from Mike Pence to Secretary of State of Georgia and so on. And those people are not always elected. Our judiciary kind of held. That's in question of how that holds this year. So something I think we all should watch, because that in some ways will be a test of the resiliency of our system, if it holds as I hope it does.
Yeah. Well, this is what I think everyone's worried about. I mean, it's not like we're not forewarned about what's possible, and things never repeat themselves in precisely the same way. But I can certainly imagine violence at polling stations and counting stations and court cases and a long period of uncertainty. So I just kind of just hope it will be clean, it will be easy. However it comes out, people will respect it, and we can then live with all the consequences. So I just want to thank you all very, very much. Thank you for your patience. And as we move off, I'm to introduce my colleague Pamela Paul to come up to the stage. Thank you all.